Right, ladies and gentlemen, a few minutes late, the very last session. And I don't think Sir Julian needs any introduction from me. He will go down in history as the last British member of the European Commission, at least the last British member in this British membership of the European Union. One never knows what will happen in the future, as they say. But beyond that, he had a very distinguished, I think, 35 years in the Foreign Office, in one shape or another, including very sensitive appointments, such as those as ambassador to Ireland and as ambassador to France in key moments of our bilateral relationship with the two countries. He was, of course, in the Commission responsible for the security union and therefore for, again, some of the most critical issues. It was most certainly not a sleeping Commission appointment by any means. He's entitled his presentation Shifting Sands, looking at both the European Union as a security actor and the impact and the way that Britain will interact with it. Sir Julian.
Thank you very much. Well done for making it this far. One last sprint for the line. I can't remember who suggested the title, but the title which I'm speaking to is Shifting Sands, EU as a Security Actor and the Future Relationship with Britain. So you do get a little bit of Brexit, but you're going to have to wait because that comes towards the end. I start from the proposition that has underlain a number of the things that have been discussed today, which is that the European Union wants to be geopolitical. It wants to put on some geopolitical muscle. It's tired of having sand kicked into its face, or, as Sigmar Gabriel has said, tired of being a vegetarian in a world of carnivores. And so led by Charles Michel, who is at the moment at the AU, and who has gone out of his way to underline the priority of Europe's relations with its sister continent, Africa, and by Ursula von der Leyen and a self-styled geopolitical commission who show every sign of wanting to use the EU's trade weight and their regulatory reach more assertively on the international stage, starting with climate and tech, but I don't think just limited to those two priorities. But the EU also sees itself as a security actor, and that actually predates the new leadership. Indeed, I was part of the story for 3 years until last November, as you kindly said. And the EU sees itself as well placed to actually play a security role, not the or an exclusive role, but nevertheless an important role. You've been spending quite a lot of today thinking about the return of big power politics. And that certainly feeds into this resurgence of focus on the EU as a geopolitical actor. But the interest the EU has and EU member states share in its role as a security actor also goes to an underlying feeling that we live in a period of unpeace, with some significant shifts in the type of security challenges that you have to try and manage, particularly a shift in threat actors and threat vectors. So threat actors encompassing, as you know very well, because you are experts in this field, non-state as well as state, and where the borders between criminal, economic, industrial, and state actors get blurred, and indeed, where it's difficult sometimes to pin down motives. Threat vectors, where, of course, there are still shots fired and bombs still go off, unfortunately, but the attack surface goes beyond military and security to encompass economic, commercial, societal issues. And the means deployed go beyond state to state to encompass intervention, interference in our societies, challenging the way we organize our politics, how communities live together, challenging our values. All of which raises some quite difficult issues around threshold and sometimes of attribution. It's not always clear whether you're under attack, when it started, and who's behind it. And it's this level of ambiguity that can raise some real challenges. How do you respond to those sorts of security challenges? And that's where the EU feels that it comes in. And member states support that. The EU, by its very nature, has a flexible range of possible responses because of the range of its policies, instruments, relationships, going from commercial, economic, all the way through to political and security. And so it can help to deliver the kind of flexible range of possible responses that you might need to deal with ambiguous security threats. Again, the EU has almost necessarily a broad sense of deterrence, which is exactly what you need when faced with these kind of ambiguous and difficult to pin down challenges. It isn't in the business of hard military deterrence, but it does work to identify risks and weaknesses and to build responses and capabilities to manage and mitigate those risks and to reinforce resilience. That's what it does across a whole range of policy areas with partners across the economy and society. And it's where the EU can make a distinct, significant contribution as a security provider. Now, and you've touched on this already today, there is debate around the EU's ambitions as a defence capability builder. Some of this actually represents continuity. The EU's been in this field for some time, not always widely recognised. It will continue, I think, to go on putting effort into civilian military missions, sometimes in challenging circumstances. But that's not entirely new. Indeed, the biggest single jump in the amount of civ-mil missions undertaken by the European Union took place in the latter half of 2005, when the number of missions went from 4 to 14, under the then UK presidency of the European Union. It will continue to promote joint projects to address capability gaps. It's got a new way of doing that through PESCO, but it's something it's been doing for some time, as some of you will know, through the European Defence Agency. It does propose to put some collective funding behind this when and if a significant European Defence Fund is agreed. And we'll have to see where that goes. But as I think we saw from the reactions to Macron's recent remarks and article in The Economist, there's very limited enthusiasm amongst member states for any of this to be done in competition with NATO. So there are some elements of continuity, but what has changed, and changed quite quickly over the last few years, and is, I think, relevant to this focus on security, is the readiness of EU member states to work together collectively to tackle a range of new and emerging threats and challenges, in particular on terrorism, on cyber-enabled challenges, on hybrid, on political interference. In all of these areas, there's been a very significant development in cooperation over recent years. Terrorism is obviously not new, but the narrative, the impact of the jihadi terror attacks across Europe from 2015, and now increasingly, I'm afraid, violent right-wing extremism in various parts of Europe, has led member states' law enforcement and security services to work together more closely than they have done so before, sharing not only threat analysis, but resources, including, crucially, sharing data and databases, coordinating responses, both to follow up, to interdict, but also to prevent and tackle radicalization. On cyber, which shot up the agenda, of course, following the big attacks, WannaCry and NotPetya, following a widespread concern about cybercrime, but also in the light of concern around possible political interference using cyber means, cyber-enabled means, on both sides of the Atlantic, led to the member states working together in a way they hadn't done before to set up cyber incident response teams, to establish a cybersecurity agency, to use standards and certification processes to drive up cybersecurity standards across the European Union, and to establish a series of cybersecurity competence centers and coordinated research. Hybrid. Well, actually here, some old threats came back into the picture, notably chemical attacks. And the response has been to reinforce cooperation and networks across Europe to deal with the full range of CBRN threats. And for the first time, to my knowledge, ministers from across the European Union have come together in a series of exercises to exercise those responses. Political interference and disinformation. Again, there was heightened awareness over the last couple of years. The behavior of some of the big social media platforms, or rather their lack of urgency in addressing some of these challenges, led to the collective engagement by member states with the platforms to use their collective weight to increase transparency and get a range of agreed measures, for example, on political ads, tackling fake accounts, proposing and promoting independent scrutiny of social media platforms, which has started to yield some results, although there's still a lot more to do in that area. And the common thread that runs through all of those subjects is like-minded countries coming together in shared self-interest to tackle shared threats to their shared values, and using the European Union as a platform for that cooperation. And this is particularly true when it comes to security challenges linked to technology, to securing our critical digital infrastructure, and tackling the abuse of existing and developing technologies to spread, for example, illegal content or to do other harms. Now, 5G has been much in the news recently. I'm not surprised. What I am surprised about is how it went for so long not attracting so much coverage. I mean, what we're talking about here is absolutely critical infrastructure. This is the digital plumbing of our connected lives. It is of absolutely central societal importance. I can't think of a more important security issue. So it's only right, I think, that we take it very seriously, and that we look not only at the quality of the pipes, but also at the credibility of the plumber. And China, of course, features in any discussion, not because anyone necessarily wants to single them out, but because of their market presence. The US, of course, also framed the debate in a certain way. Against that backdrop, EU member states came together on a voluntary basis to collectively look at this issue. Over 18 months ago, this work started, to define risks from their perspective, their collective perspective, to Europe, and to produce recommendations on what could be done to manage and mitigate those risks. And that material led to conclusions that came out very recently. The UK was actively involved in that work. It made an important contribution to that work. It also has reached a position on, in particular, Chinese technology, of course, as you all know. I just say that if the UK had felt able to frame its response more in the context of the collective EU work that it had been involved in for some time, up until last November, it might have helped to put some of the US criticism targeting the UK more into context. And the same is going to happen. The same processes are going to happen around data and AI and other new critical technologies which have a really important security dimension. And they're going to happen around illegal and harmful content. Some member states, Germany, France, are more advanced than others. But all the 27 see benefit in working collectively together on these issues, because together they can have the heft to try and either achieve results working with the big social media platforms, or to take a position which is based on their assessment of their security rather than something that somebody else, America or anyone else, is telling them to think. And that's the important point. On all of these issues, they benefit from being, I would say they need to be, addressed collectively. That means with industry, obviously, with like-minded partners and organizations, US, NATO, G7, G20, as far as possible. And you need to try and avoid unnecessary barriers. You need to try and avoid building friction into your cooperation on these issues. And that's a key message. It's the one key message which I hope that we can keep in mind and that it doesn't get lost in the coming months. Because, of course, all of these challenges aren't going away, and the work to manage and deal with them needs to continue. What does that mean for the future relationship with Britain? Much of the focus, analysis, commentary has, understandably, so far, centered on the future trade and economic relationship. But, and I'm glad to say the event today, I think, is an important contribution to this, there's also a future security relationship that we need to think about. Not least, what are we going to do to tackle some of these things that we've just been talking about, which are, however you look at them, shared challenges. Now, the Prime Minister, in his speech last week, looked forward to continued cooperation with the European Union in foreign and defence policy whenever interests converge, though this would not necessarily require any new treaty or institutions. The government's written statement to Parliament said there's a mutual interest with the European Union in protecting citizens and envisaged a pragmatic agreement on law enforcement and judicial cooperation on criminal matters covering operational capabilities. On the EU side, the still draft, still under discussion, negotiating mandate, and the accompanying explanation and commentary from the Commission certainly envisage the negotiations and an eventual agreement which they see as a whole, covering security arrangements on law enforcement, judicial cooperation, foreign policy, security, and defence. They envisage cooperation on sanctions, on development, case by case on EU civil missions. Also, in a bit more detail, arrangements on operational capabilities like Europol, the European Police Platform, the Schengen Information System, this huge shared collective law enforcement database, which has now more than 75 million objects and people of interest entered into it, and which was consulted across the European Union more than 5 billion times last year. On PRUM, which is a smaller targeted database that shares information on DNA, fingerprints, and vehicle registration. On passenger name records, which is the database that is used to check if there are patterns of suspicious movement through airports. And on a replacement for the European arrest warrant. Albeit that some of these arrangements are proposed to be quite limited and basic. The EU side are clear that cooperation in this area is predicated on UK adherence to the ECHR, and that here as elsewhere, only the ECJ, the European Court of Justice, can interpret matters of EU law. HMG have been equally clear that the ECJ and indeed the EU legal order must not constrain the autonomy of the UK's legal system in any way. When it comes to sharing or transferring personal data, which is absolutely key to much law enforcement and security cooperation, the databases that I've just mentioned, for instance, as it is also, of course, for much economic and trade activity as well, the EU is clear that this requires a data adequacy decision, which they will endeavour to adopt by the end of this year. HMG sees the EU's data adequacy assessment process as essentially technical and confirming that the reality is that the UK will be operating the same regulatory framework as the EU at the end of this year. The EU side, I'm afraid to say it's more complicated than that. So what does all this add up to? I think it adds up to a willingness to cooperate, but it's still not clear to me that the two sides are going to will the means for that cooperation. I used to say in my last job that there was a clear shared mutual self-interest in finding ways of tackling together the full range of shared threats, because those threats weren't targeting one country or another in Europe in particular. Very often they were targeting our shared values, the very way we live our lives, and that we were stronger tackling them together. I also used to argue that there was a distinction between security cooperation with this clear shared interest and economic and trade relations, which were necessarily more distributive. But the EU's position, as set out in the proposed negotiating mandate, is clearly that all the aspects of the future relationship need to be treated in parallel with overarching governance arrangements. If you like, the institutional equivalent of nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. And I don't want to hide from you that I think that that's going to be a challenge. The economic and trade negotiations are going to be difficult. That follows from the starting point of the two sides. And I think, in addition, there's a risk of misunderstandings and possible miscalculations. I fear that my ex-colleagues in the European Union, some of them at least, misinterpret the significance of the government's majority. I see no evidence that it means that HMG think that they are going to have scope to soften their line, to move towards the EU as negotiations progress. Again, I think the European Union, some of them at least, think that by raising the bar, forcing linkages, making things more complicated, they can somehow change the nature of the debate here and change HMG's approach. Putting fish up front, holding financial services equivalents in abeyance, going for maximum level playing field preconditions, a tough line on mutual recognition, seeking upfront agreement to heavy penalties for any divergence. Frankly, I'm not sure that's going to have the kind of effect the EU think. And I'm not sure that the playbook that in the EU's eyes worked out last time around, playing the clock, playing issues long, up against deadlines in order to exert pressure, whether that's actually going to work the same way this time around. So, I think there's a risk. There's a risk that comes from linking all of these issues together. Objectively, there is a case for cooperation on foreign, security, and defense policy, in tackling terrorism, cyber-enabled threats, disinformation, other hybrid threats, in promoting law enforcement and judicial cooperation, from everybody's perspective. The EU as a security actor should be working with like-minded partners, and that includes the United Kingdom. A geopolitical European Union needs to build coalitions of partners and allies in order precisely to have the kind of effect, the kind of heft and reach it seeks on the international stage, including on climate and on tech. And that needs to include, in some way, working with the UK. So I hope that all involved can hold on to that as things unfold over the coming months. And I hope that organizations like Rusi here and your partner in today's meeting, Changing Europe with the UK, can continue to make the case for not losing sight of the areas where we are better if we find a way of continuing to work together. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You're ready to take a few questions? Yeah. So Julian has kindly agreed to take a number of questions. I should say that what attracted me most is this sort of double play on the geopolitical commission. Yes, it is a geopolitical commission which is prepared to be more than a vegetarian, although I don't know why one is so dismissive of vegetarians. But it is also, if it is a geopolitical commission, it must think more than just putting fish together with counterterrorism cooperation in the same basket and claim that one is not, that one should not be traded to the other. Right, a forest of hands, so let me start. The gentleman over there, Mike Gapes, if I may. Yeah, coming up.
Thank you very much, and welcome. I was interested in your remark about running down the clock, because of course there is the option, which is entirely in the hands of the UK government, to go for an extension. But so the clock, in a sense, is being run down by the British government rather than necessarily by the European Union. But on the wider issues, how much do we lose in terms of global security and European security by the UK no longer participating in the External Action Service and also not being in the room at PESCO?
But Mike, you accept that running the clock is a sport that both can play?
Yes.
Right. So Julian.
We're going to take them individually.
Yeah,
Okay,
why don't you?
Super.
Yeah.
That'll be more sportif. I don't speak for HMG. I used to speak for the Commission. I don't speak for the Commission either. So you can take what I say for what it's worth. I think that the problem with running the clock is you can run the clock against it any time frame. So my problem is with trying to fix the order of negotiations in a way that links things that perhaps shouldn't be linked, rather than the deadline at the end of this year or the deadline 12 months later. On what might you lose? Well, you chose two subjects that I wouldn't necessarily have put at the top of the list, but by definition, if you're not a member state, you're a third country, you're not in the institutions. So I have no successor, there's no British commissioner, there's no ministers in the councils, as you know, and there's a few, but not that many, British officials in the EAS, because the EAS, like the Commission, is not throwing British officials out. But the EAS won't be working to promote British interests. It'll be working to promote the interests of the member states, the 27. Now, I hope there'll be areas where it's still possible to work together. That's the focus of my appeal. And the EAS would then be involved, along with some of the admirable diplomats who you've heard from today, representing HMG. Not in the room in PESCO. Well, that takes you into a different set of issues, which is how might you envisage making defense capability work when the UK is a third country, like the United States or Canada. And indeed, there's a whole series of discussions, some of which you've touched upon today, about how you might do that if you wanted to do it. The things that I think that you will definitely miss out on in connection with security, in the broad sense that I've just sketched it out, unless you do something about it, are actually the capabilities that have been built up together over years and years at 28. So the law enforcement world will tell you that they really value the capabilities they got through various agencies and through various databases and through various legal instruments like the European arrest warrant. I'm not telling you that. I'm reporting what frontline practitioners say. So you lose that unless you find some way of reproducing it in some form. I think that really matters. I think that more recently, which is why I mentioned them, there have been a number of developments to do with tech, not only the underlying critical infrastructure, but also possible abuse of technology to do harm, where everybody has gained from cooperation. And indeed, in a number of cases, the UK has been a leading voice up until the end of last year in building that cooperation. And I think you will be weaker unless you find some way of reproducing cooperation on those issues.
In short, a lose-lose outcome if these matters that you described are not tackled. Gentleman over there.
My name is Benjamin Bilski. I work on trade policy strategy in DIT. Thank you for your presentation. I really quite liked the point you made that the difference between Europe and the UK is going to be not on matters of substance and areas where we are willing to cooperate, but more the structural issues around it and questions of governance. It seemed to me that the European Union style of doing diplomacy is very similar to the German style of doing diplomacy, of having the massive opening bid that is the Gesamtkonzept that sets out their position and what they believe your position to be and how those positions come together. And in that way, creating the overall framework within which the agreement has to take place. Whereas the question of the framework and the governance is the problem from the British perspective. So my question is, to what extent, on the one hand, are we prepared to deal with this style of diplomacy on the outside? And secondly, to what extent is there willingness on the European side to make structural adjustments in order to come to an agreement where fundamentally we do agree on substance in many cases?
$64,000, if we're allowed to use that currency question. What I do think is that as well as attaching importance to the framework, not just for these negotiations, but as an approach to negotiating, not just trade negotiations, but all sorts of structured arrangements with third countries, as well as the commitment to that, which definitely exists on the EU side. The EU have been very good, perhaps particularly good in relation to Brexit, in framing the discussion. So I don't know how far we're going to be able to get them to move away from some kind of framework, exact contours to be defined, because that's the way they conceive of engagement with third countries. But I do think that we should have I do think that HMG has an interest in having a jolly good go at trying to challenge the so far quite often successful framing of the debate by my old friend and colleague Michel Barnier and lots of others. And one of the things that they use to manage that rather effectively is a lot of transparency. Now, there's a reason why the Commission is big on transparency. The EU in general is quite big on transparency, and that's because it's really very difficult to keep anything secret at 27. But they have managed, and they've got very good at it over the years, to, and I don't want to use this word in a sort of emotional way, but to weaponize transparency in a way that frames a discussion that makes it very difficult for the other party in that discussion or negotiation to find a way in. And I think that that is something that not only HMG should be thinking about, but that they are already starting to try and challenge in this new phase of discussions.
But of course you would agree that tying everything up in one big parcel makes it much more difficult to reject. So there's no incentive for them to desist from doing this.
So this game seems to be that I get every question plus a follow-up question. I don't mind, but you're depriving some others in the
I shan't.
I've set out what I said about the, I think, possible risks of insisting on bundling what I think are, by their nature, different sets of discussions. So I'm not going to go into the whole detail of the economic and trade relationship, but with the economic and trade relationship on one side and the security relationship on the other, I think you have different kinds of issues which could be managed in different ways.
Lucy Fisher.
Lucy Fisher from The Times. Thank you, Sir Julian. Could I ask you just to spell out, please. You've made clear you think that there is a risk of bundling all these issues together. If there is a total breakdown in trade talks, if we leave the EU, say at the end of this year, without a trade deal, do you think that there will be a total breakdown of the security cooperation? Or do you think that there is a minimum level that would be maintained? And if so, could you kind of detail what that would look like? Thank you.
Well, I don't know, because you're asking me either to speak for HMG or to speak for the Commission, and I speak for neither. But seen, as it were, from the outside, I think that there is a risk that comes from bundling, and therefore I think it's worth at least asking these questions and challenging the bundling. I do think, and I know a number of others from talking to them separately, I think share this concern, that the idea that you could have not even necessarily a complete breakdown, but real problems on the trade and economic discussions, and at the same time merrily be able to continue seamlessly very close cooperation on security and defense and law enforcement and challenging the kind of threats that I've been talking about. That, I mean, I just want to test that. I'm not entirely sure that that is going to work in the real world.
No supplementary for me. Deborah Haynes.
Thank you. I'm Deborah Haynes from Sky. Following on from what Lucy said, I mean, given your job, your previous job, you will have a deep understanding of the benefits of that of the security partnerships and arrangements. Could you just set out what it actually would mean in reality if we did, like you say, potentially have this, security being held for ransom as part of an overall agreement, nothing being agreed until everything's agreed? Like, what areas come off worse? Like, who comes off worse? Does Britain come off worse? Is it in disinformation areas? Does EU come off worse? Like, can you give what does it mean? Thanks.
Your language hold to ransom, not my language. But if it is not possible to re-establish some form of cooperation on some of the law enforcement agencies and databases, there will be a cost. And that is clearly stated on a number of occasions by frontline law enforcement practitioners in the UK and in many of the EU 27. So I don't think that doesn't seem to me to be a topic for speculation. Exactly what form the cost would be would depend on to what extent you've managed to find some sort of way of continuing to cooperate. I mean, there are third countries in Europol, so there's no reason why the UK can't have a relationship with Europol. How deep is that relationship? How does it work? Raises lots of technical issues. There aren't third countries involved in the Schengen information system. So I think it's quite a stretch to imagine that there's going to be a special arrangement made for the UK to put it in the Schengen information system. But are there ways in which you can find some cooperation so that there can be sharing of information on, for example, terrorists and murderers who are entered into the Schengen information system and who are regularly identified by the use of that system? PRUM is a different system where there are, again, arrangements where you can have cooperation with third countries. So with a will, you can find a way of making that work. PNR, the system that's used to follow people who are arriving in airports, there are arrangements with third countries. There are arrangements with the United States, Canada, or Australia, for example. They are complicated. They get challenged. They are linked to the position on data and the EU's view of how the third country handles personal data. But hopefully it will be possible to find some sort of arrangement to deal with that, because without it, lots of movements of largely criminals in that case risk going undetected. And that's what we've learned in practice over the recent years, and that's why a whole load of countries are lining up to try and have PNR relationships with the EU. And, you know, we haven't got time, but you can go through the various different agencies and instruments in that way. You can identify what's at play, what the challenges are, and if there's a will, you can try and find ways of maintaining some form of more or less effective cooperation, provided that you are pursuing a wider security relationship and that hasn't got caught up and isn't in bulk because of other things that are going on in the negotiations.
Thank you. The gentleman over there.
Thank you. Stephen Andrews, member of RUSI. This morning we touched on issues to do with value-based foreign policy versus interest-based foreign policy. In your presentation, you said that you talked about countries working together and had a long list of things ending up with shared values rather than shared interests. Do you see that, given the need to work perhaps with different authoritarian governments around Europe, as some might see it, but certainly outside of Europe, that we're right to go and maintain a position of shared values, or do you think we will be moving towards shared interests?
I referred to shared values in the context of some of the security threats that we face where those who are trying to do us harm, I think, are not targeting particular countries, but they are targeting the way we live our lives. And the way we live our lives across Europe, and you can debate the fine detail, but the way we live our lives across Europe reflects, to a large extent, a series of shared values. That was the context in which I was using it. I don't think I was entering quite into the heart of the debate that you were having earlier on today. I do think that there are, against these threats, you can identify terrorism, cyber-enabled, hybrid, misuse and abuse of technology to try and undermine the way our societies work. You can identify like-minded countries, and those like-minded countries should find a way of standing together.
Mm-hmm. Professor Johns.
In a few days' time, the members of the European Union are going to have their first discussion on the budget for the next 7 or so years. And one of the issues there will be how much money they put into defence, the European Defence Fund in particular. At the moment, it looks as if the UK is very much going to be a third country in relation to that fund, and the fund is going to be designed to promote collaboration between EU member states in defence industry at the expense, in some cases, of non-EU EU member states such as ourselves. So my question is, in that budget negotiation, partly because of Brexit, the European Union is not going to have as much money to spend as it has at present, and it's going to make some very hard choices. Is it in the UK's interest for defence to be given a high priority by the European Union in its forward budget, or would we prefer a weak EDF and therefore not have a fund which will be acting against our defence industrial interests?
You should have asked Angus perhaps in an earlier session. Two things. One, whether a large or small fund is going to act against UK interests is something that isn't entirely clear yet, because it depends how the fund works. And it depends what it does, and it depends the extent to which the UK wants to cooperate with some of the projects that it might be funding. So we don't know that yet. On whether it will be a large or a small fund, we don't know that until the budget negotiations advance further. I would just note that the Commission has been quite ambitious in what it's put forward, and it's got good arguments for the ambition that it's set out. It's not the only chunk of money that is proposed to go into defence-related matters. There's a military mobility fund, for example, that is also, I think, quite important. But these budget negotiations are going to be very tough. And I'm just trying to work out who it is in those budget negotiations who's going to be speaking up for defence as opposed to cohesion funding or agriculture funding if there's a squeeze, or rather, when there's a squeeze.
Thank you, Sir Julian. I'm Ewan Grant. I'm a former law enforcement intelligence analyst who's worked on a number of EC-funded programs in the Western Balkans and Ukraine. I'm also very well aware of how fortunate the public interest was across Europe that Mr. Wainwright was appointed as head of Europol. There was some that was very important. My question follows on from your closing remarks and your responses to Lucy Fisher and Deborah Haynes about where we go next. And I think there's a leading indicator of whether cooperation is being prepared, and then we'll work out the details of it. Later this year, the EPPO, the European Public Prosecutor's Office, kicks off. Now, that's on paper, that's got a fairly narrow remit, but it is actually a very deep one. Are there any indications that the importance of close cooperation always between the UK and the EU, and it would also apply to the EU and other countries, not least the United States, is being taken forward, or is it being really looked at in a siloed way in Brussels or indeed in London? Thank you.
It's a good question. I'm not aware from my knowledge and from the public documents that have so far come out that the EPPO is featured as an item for discussion in the context of future cooperation.
Right. We'll take two questions, and these will be the last ones at the end there. First, my colleague.
Oliver Major, I'm a visiting fellow here at RUSI. So I'm interested if you could comment on the level to which the European Union is a monolithic block in this security question as opposed to trade and industry. We tend to talk about it that way because we tend to approach the Commission. But it's very obvious that in NATO that there are very different views from different bits of the alliance. How far are those divergent views within the EU, do you think, aligned with views on trade and industry? And how far might we see prioritisation within the Commission start to change if those two areas diverge? So that those who are desperate for a security relationship with the UK over a trade one start to have a different approach to those who are prioritising a trade relationship rather than a security one.
Right, and the gentleman right at the back.
Thanks very much. Simon Strickland, Cabinet Office. You mentioned the view that the European Union occasionally sees itself as a vegetarian in a world of carnivores. And we heard a little bit earlier today from Nick Houghton and Professor Hill about the idea that the UK should perhaps adopt a new realism. And I'm wondering whether you're suggesting that the European Union is attempting to adopt a new realism in the kind of philosophical sense of realism. And secondly, whether you think the UK should be adopting a realist approach in its relationship to the EU or a more constructivist line of thinking. Thank you.
Right.
Right.
Realist and constructivist.
So, trade-off between security and trade. Well, I think I'm probably arguing against a trade-off against security and trade. I'm arguing that actually you have a set of issues that are to do with the trade and economic relationship that are, by definition, hard, that will almost inevitably be distributive with winners and losers, and which therefore have to be worked through in a certain way. And there you need a healthy dose of realism on both sides. But that nature of future relationship isn't necessarily the same when it comes to security, I would say foreign policy, security, and defense. And that you need to be conscious of that as you're trying to manage the discussions on building a new relationship. So I'm arguing against any simple trade-off. I'm not actually sure, I was trying to think about it, and maybe others will have views, I'm not actually sure that I can think of a member state that would say that they wanted to put security ahead of their trade interests. I can think of a number of member states who say security is very important, and we need to find a way of doing security. Oh, but by the way, trade's very important, and the economic relationship's very important. We need to find a way of doing that as well. And I can think of some member states who are slightly less focused on the security relationship. But I think what I'm arguing is that you shouldn't be trying to set this up in a way that is either one big ball of wax or set up for simple trade-off. As to different sorts of realism, I hope that everybody can stay realistic about this. It's going to be very tough. It's going to be very bumpy. Part of my appeal is to my ex-colleagues in the European Union to remain realistic as well, and to be realistic about what they are seeking, because some of the things they are seeking may not have the effect that they appear to intend, and they just need to be aware of that.
Thank you. I think we bombarded you with far too many questions, and I think it came across as a very, very, very strong message. First, about the sheer quantity of security and defense work that is going on in the Commission. It is serious stuff, and those who like to poke fun at the Commission should think again. And secondly, that there is every reason and interest for both sides to have as close a relationship as possible. But that would require both sides to be realistic about the political room for maneuver and about the distinction between the feasible and the desirable. I'm very, very grateful. I know that you said you're not speaking for the Commission or for HMG on this point, but you're speaking with a great deal of wisdom, and we're really very grateful for you. In many respects, you pooled a lot of the themes there for which the day started. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You can sit. You can sit if you want. You can, yeah.